Okay, great.
Amazing. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Shihadih, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher with Shortlidge. And today I'll be talking about um, assessing the Evolving the Culture of Biology program through the lens of the teacher-centered systemic reform model. And so you'll get to learn all about what Evolving the Culture of Biology is and how we've applied this framework. First, I want to start off with a quick kind of call and response. So, with a show of Zoom hands, how many of you either currently or have taught in a college setting? Amazing. Okay, the basically everyone. Amazing. Now I want you to think about your first teaching experience. Um, were you trained to teach? And if so, what did that look like? And feel free to drop your answers in the chat. Okay. Yep, I'm seeing some responses. Unfortunately, a lot of these really mirror my first teaching experience as a graduate student at UC Berkeley. I was kind of thrown into a classroom with little to no guidance. It was, I think someone said, like, throw you to the wolves type situation, which is unfortunate. We don't want that, right? But what this leads us to is that we know that TAs are teaching, right? 94% of STEM TAs teach undergrads during their PhDs. And typically, TAs are not adequately prepared to teach, as we just saw in the Zoom chat, unfortunately. We also know that poor teaching is one of the primary reasons that students leave STEM fields. And taken all together, all of these factors is what motivated this team to put together the Evolving the Culture of Biology program, which is an NSF-funded program that is really focused on improving undergraduate education through prioritizing teaching assistant, teaching professional development, or TATPD nationally. I want to give a shout out to our ECB leadership team, many of whom you should recognize. They're very active BioTap members. So Adam Chouinard, Caleb Heinrich, Mitra Asgari, Star Lee, Stephanie Gutzler, and Aaron Shortlidge. And so a little bit more about this program. So ECB develops, facilitates, and studies regional workshops. We've had 3 cohorts so far, as you can see on the map. And each cohort is comprised of small teams of scholars from 10 different institutions. And these scholars are supported over the course of 1 year to develop and implement reformed TATPD at their institutions. And so, what this year looks like is we kick off with a summer workshop. It's about 2.5 days. They're a part of structured learning communities throughout the year. Towards the end of the program, we have a celebration where teams can present on a year's worth of work and what they've been able to accomplish. And then we wrap up with scholar exit interviews. And so today I'll be focusing on cohort 1, which comes from the Southeast. 5 out of these 10 institutions are R1s, and 4 are minority serving institutions. And so to delve a little bit into our research methods, we used both surveys and interviews. We had a pre-program survey that was developed to gather information on participants ahead of the program. And then we had semi-structured interviews where these questions were iteratively developed to understand participants' experiences implementing their reformed TATPD. And both the program and all of our research tools were informed by the teacher-centered systemic reform model. And this is a change theory that posits that instructional practices can be impacted or changed through the consideration of 3 factors. There are personal factors, which look like a demographic profile or what job you hold within your institution. Teachers' thinking, which relates to teaching beliefs, self-efficacy, and dissatisfaction. And then contextual factors. The main one we'll be talking about today relates to cultural context. And that can be within a broader cultural context or within your institution or department. Um, just to give you all a few examples of how we use these factors to develop our interview questions. Um, Looking at personal factors, we ask questions like, how did your current position impact your decision to want to work on TATPD? Looking at teacher thinking, what are your guiding principles as an instructor? How have these guiding principles influenced your approach to TATPD reform? And then looking at contextual factors, we asked what sort of barriers did you encounter while working to implement your TATPD plan? And then tell me about any changes you've observed in your department since you've begun working on TATPD. So back to our research methods. Our survey was a Qualtrics survey, and that was sent out via email prior to the summer workshops. And then looking at the data, we ran descriptive statistics, and we looked at both individual responses and grouped responses by institutional teams. And then looking at our interviews, a researcher was trained by the Shortlidge group to conduct the end of year semi-structured interviews, and we had 24 total. Interviews were transcribed, and then they were coded by multiple researchers using both inductive and deductive methodology to identify overarching themes and develop a code book. We analyzed individual interviews, but then we did group them and analyze them, looking at institutional teams to again to see if there were any patterns. And so this leads us to our interview question. So our main question is, what components of the TCSR impact the implementation of and also the approaches to TATPD reform? So we're looking at impacts of implementation, so ability to implement or not, and then what factors impacted the approach to the TATPD reform. And so we're going to start off with the survey. And again, this survey was administered before the program. And this really looked for information related to all of the factors of the TCSR with a goal of better understanding scholars' contexts going into the program. And I'm going to give a very brief overview of what we found from the survey. And this is categorized by the three factors of the TCSR. So first being personal factors. 10 of our participants were tenure track faculty, 11 were non-tenure track faculty or staff, and 3 were graduate students. Of those, 7 were administrators. Looking at teacher thinking, we surveyed for both teaching and learning beliefs and self-efficacy. And what we found was looking at teacher and learning beliefs, our participants were both teacher and student-centered, with student-centered being a little bit higher, so fairly good responses. And everyone had fairly high self-efficacy related to both pedagogy and content-related classroom activities. And then moving on to contextual factors, we had a couple questions that looked at institutional culture, and most teams reported that their institutional culture was more or less favorable, with the exception of teams 8 and 10. And then we asked them about their TA culture, if TAs valued or were interested in teaching, and most here were either unsure or neutral, or we saw like moderate responses. Um, and what I want you to take away from this like quick slide overview of all of these questions is based on the TCSR, teams really seemed to be in a good position to successfully implement reform. And so the baseline seemed really promising. And so here we're going to go into the end of program interview data. And so just as a reminder, we did code all of these interviews individually, but then the data was then analyzed once we grouped everyone into their institutional teams. So I will be talking about institutional teams from here on out. And so what we found is we were actually able to group or to categorize each of these 10 teams into one of 3 categories or profiles. And we're going to go through each of these in a minute, but just to orient you a little bit. Our first 2 profiles, our long strides and our refiners, were both teams that were successfully able to make meaningful progress towards their goals. So what they considered to be successful. And then one of our teams, our high barrier, low buy-in profile, these were teams that were unsuccessful or unable to make meaningful work towards their goals. And so we're going to start off by talking about the differences between successful and unsuccessful teams, and then we'll go into the differences between the two successful teams. And so to get us started, our high barrier and low buy-in teams, there were two of them, were teams that were unsuccessfully able to implement their reform plans because of seemingly insurmountable barriers. These barriers kind of fell into two categories. The first being low to no structural power. We categorize this under personal factors to orient you back to the TCSR. These were teams that didn't have an administrator on their team and or didn't have autonomy over the programs that they were trying to reform if they were trying to reform something that was already existing. And they also faced a negative and unsupportive culture. And so that looked like low buy-in or just general negative culture around TATPD. And this was categorized under contextual factors. And then just a couple of quotes from our participants. This is a scholar from Team 10. Definitely faculty buy-in. I think that it would have been great for our entire biology department to go to the workshop, the ECB workshop, to let them know how essential TATPD is, because this only works, because buy-in only works from the top down. Then it's more successful. That's what I realized. So here we saw that this team really is facing an issue with faculty buy-in. So sorry. Well, sorry, y'all. And then the second quote, oh my goodness. Y'all hear me okay with the barking? I'm so sorry. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. And then the second quote, we didn't really get any funding to invite someone to teach our TATPD. So it was a little bit difficult to try to get someone to come in and teach us when you don't have any funding. And so here we're seeing an issue with administrative buy-in, particularly related to funding. And now to move on to our two teams, our two profiles that were successful. So the first being our long strides teams. And these were three of our teams fell under this profile. And so these were teams that started off with minimal to no programming. And they really focused on building out new TPD infrastructure with the support of an administrator who was on their team. And so their goals really looked at, their goals really focused on adding new TPD offerings while also improving any existing offerings. And some people were starting from scratch, some had a couple of offerings that were already in existence and they worked to improve them. And so the main takeaway here is that these participants recognized that their existing structures were insufficient. And so this relates to dissatisfaction with existing programming, which falls under teacher thinking within the TCSR. This participant states, we also learned that we had TAs that came out at first very confident that they were going to be great at teaching. And as soon as we saw them teach, we were like, oh no, you're not that great. You do need help to improve your teaching. And so what they saw is the performance of their TAs was not up to par and therefore needed more offerings, more TPD offerings in order to improve that teaching. And interestingly enough, these teams also prioritized garnering broad buy-in for this new programming across their departments. And so they preempted this, really focusing on the contextual factor of culture, considering that they were adding more offerings and expecting more of their TAs. And so this participant from Team 1 says, getting buy-in not just from the graduate TAs, but from their PIs as well, was a consideration of what we could do because you may know not all PIs exactly support releasing their graduate students out for teaching. We had to make sure that we had good buy-in from all of those parties. And then our last profile is our refiners. 5 of our teams fell under this category. And these are teams that had robust existing programming. And they really focused on refining existing curriculum and structures. These teams either had an administrator as part of their group or had a member who had autonomy over the TPD offerings they intended to reform. Their goals really focused on programmatic growth and improvement. Specifically, looking to shift programming from just logistics to including more evidence-based teaching practices and pedagogy, and also creating greater cohesion across all of the offerings. And so a quick quote. And again, these participants recognize that their programming could be improved. And again, this falls under teacher thinking. We really wanted to focus on evidence-based teaching and active learning, and we made a really good shift towards that. This year, one of the things this program has made us do is think about how we build the whole program. So we're thinking of shuffling up our orientation, make that more robust, and continue to work on those broader connections. And so this takes us back to our initial research question. Which components of the TCSR impact implementation and approach? And we saw that all of these factors really impacted the TA-TPD reform process, really validating the use of the TCSR, although certain factors were more salient than others, depending on what we were looking at. So specifically, personal factors related to structural power and contextual factors related to culture and buy-in really impacted a team's ability to impact change, while teacher thinking was the main driver when it came to the approach that each team took. And so just to conclude, while we also observed broad impacts of this reform process outside of programmatic outcomes, which was the focus of the presentation today, our participants also perceived increases in both buy-in and saw cultural shifts. And this looked like TA improvements, building community amongst the TAs, a variety of positive culture shifts, increased buy-in from both faculty and TAs, and some participants perceived improvements in undergraduate engagement as well. And so altogether, we hope that this work can really inform the ways in which we're thinking about TA-TPD and the ways that these different factors can impact the success of a reform process as we continue to work to improve the quality of TA-run classrooms. And with that, if you want to learn more about this project, our paper is currently under review, so hopefully you'll be able to read the story in its entirety in a few months. If you want to know and learn more about the ECB program, feel free to check out our website using the QR code. And if you'd like to ask me questions directly, please feel free to email me. And with that, I want to thank my mentor, Erin Shortlidge, and my research assistant, Elizabeth Runkle-Baez, for all their support in this project, current and past members of our group, and most importantly, the entire ECB leadership team. So we'll take any questions if we have time.
We have a minute for questions.
Perfect.
Does anyone have any questions for Diallo? Look in the
I'm just looking in the chat.
chat.
I see one from Grant. In what ways are your current understandings of these category types informing your future work with departments? I think that's a great question. I think this could be really helpful for departments that are trying to improve their TPD to one, like assess what are the barriers that they might face before even starting a TPD process and looking to kind of address those before trying to make any large sweeping changes. We also saw that like there is this really positive shift with people really, currently starting out with logistics, like needing TAs to know what their jobs are, but really pushing that towards like including evidence-based teaching practices, pedagogy, things like that. So I think this gives departments a really good pathway for how to scale up and like build out their TA TPD and how they can like look to improve it. So I think it's kind of multifold. We hope to include this with future teams. And I hope that, if departments, do read this, that they can use it to inform like the work that they'd like to do on TA-TPD. I hope that answers your question.